Thank you very much to the organizer, Marta Faustino, Elertelo Pedro Dotto, and special greetings to Michael Chase and Eli Kramer, with whom I've been having the chance to collaborate in the past years and hope to do more in the coming years. So let me now share my slides. Yeah, so I will read today the basic sketch of the article and try somehow to have some illustrations of the main idea. So this article intends to elucidate the application of Pierre Hadot's model of philosophy as a way of life in the historical and philological studies of Buddhism, that is in the academic field of Buddhist studies, generally a branch of religious studies and Asian studies, as well as for the constitution of a Buddhist philosophy properly, or as such, with potential relevance to contemporary issues. So there's two perspectives are meant to articulate to the twofold methodology of Pierre Hadot. One, the philological historical method with its effort of objectivity in order not to project our preferences into ancient texts and in order to establish what they meant in their original context or cultural life world. And this is arguably the scope of religious studies or Asian studies. And two, the philosophical method proper, centered on reflexivity and rational argumentation, and that may reveal what these ancient texts or traditions may mean to us in order to properly respond to our existential situation and needs. And in order to articulate those two elements together, I will especially consider, on the basis of well-established results in the field, the original Buddhist articulation of the quest of wisdom, from which we may conceive, in dialogue with Pierre Hadot, a Buddhist philosophy or philosophia. Since this handbook, so I intend really in this paper to offer a gateway to Buddhism for philosophers. So the audience will be really philosophers who wish to explore, approach, or dialogue with Buddhism, and in the general orientation defined by Pierre Hadot. So the presentation of the chapter will be rather synthetic. I will try to highlight the major categories and their articulation, and provide all the relevant sources to get oriented on to dive deeper into the ocean of Buddhist texts and tradition. And today I will mainly mention two major books, Rupert Gethin's Foundations of Buddhism and Jan Westerhoff, The Golden Age of Indian Buddhist Philosophy. So I think that such synthetic methods will be necessary, since in this handbook, each chronological period of philosophy in the West is covered by one distinct chapter. And in a non-Western philosophy, we will be treating in one chapter the whole. So in the case of Buddhism, it's more than 2,500 years, and the entire continent of Asia from India to Japan. I also intend in this chapter to offer a foundation to students or researchers in Buddhist studies, and we wish to further engage Buddhism as philosophy, according to Marc Sideritz, and with Hadot, philosophy as a way of life, guided by the very idea of Buddhism, of wisdom, and following its Buddhist or Greek expressions. So this is the outline of the chapter in the making. And in part one, I will review the idea of philosophy as a way of life by Hadot and its impact, influence, and relevance for Buddhist studies by considering the state of the art, so to speak. And on this basis, in part two, I will consider that the Buddhist model of the threefold wisdom, or the three steps in the acquisition of wisdom through study, reflection, and meditation, form the original Buddhist articulation of philosophical discourse, spiritual exercise, and a way of life. And this will serve to frame a short history of Buddhist philosophical schools and ways of life, as well as to inquire into the relationship between discursive and non-discursive methods, with special attention to Buddhist theories and manuals of meditation. And in part three, I will narrow down in particular on one concept, the original Buddhist concept of mindfulness, with the argument that it forms the thread connecting those different layers together. And I particularly appreciated Stephen's notion from Confucianism of reverential attention, and especially the connection with reading, which is very much very central in Buddhism too. So I will talk in this part about the actual acquisition of self-knowledge, this connection with the concentration on the present moment, this dimension of atemporality that's very important for Hadot. But in the part three, I will take especially the examples of two Buddhist texts that I will present a little bit later. So Pierre Hadot's notion of philosophy as a way of life, guided by the idea of wisdom, with its therapeutic and soteriological value, is very much in harmony with Buddhism and more largely Indian and Asian traditions. As for Buddhism, the lucid confrontation with the problem of suffering, gross, subtle, or existential, is a very starting point of the Buddhist inquiry, with the famous first noble truth of the suffering, leading to envision its cause, cessation, and the path toward its cessation. This is a well-known Four Noble Truths that has taken the form of a medical diagnostic. And it is precisely in Buddhism a transformative knowledge, wisdom, or awakening that constitutes the main medicine or panacea. And as many means for its obtention, various meditation techniques have been considerably developed in this tradition, and this is another reason for the great interest of scholars of Buddhism in Pierre Hadot's works and its well-known emphasis on the notion of spiritual exercises and, of course, Foucault's idea of technologies of the self. It is also now well established that rigorous rational argumentation is to be found in Asian philosophies and Buddhist traditions, and some of my colleagues have chosen to focus rather on those elements in order to show in the Western academia the philosophical dignity of Buddhism, or more largely of Indian traditions. But I think that Hadot's tour de force has been especially to show the articulation of philosophical discourse and philosophical way of life, and it was beautifully weaved a few days ago by Marta Faustino, so I will not repeat it today. Yeah, so now just to review very quickly the field of philosophy as a way of life in Buddhist studies. Let me just check the time a little bit sometimes. Yeah. So after a first mention of Pierre Hadot by George Rufus on the ethical nature of meditative practice, it was, I believe, Matthew Kapstein who wrote the first full-fledged argument for rethinking Buddhism in critical light of the redefinition of philosophy by Pierre Hadot. Previously, there had been in Buddhist studies a long tradition of investigating the relationship between the Buddhist production of scholastic writings and the experimentation of meditative states, especially with Lambert Schmidhausen. And Vincent Elchinger at the École Pratique d'Haute Études also developed an extensive argument based on a close reading of Hadot's works, but he had important reserves about the application of the concept of philosophy as a way of life or spiritual exercises into late Indian Buddhism, given the lack of historical knowledge of this tradition, of her lack of historical knowledge of its institution, and especially was particularly specialized into the sophistication of Buddhist epistemology. And for him, he did interpret it as losing a little bit the soteriological perspective. Later, Kapstein and Sarah McClintock have articulated responses to that, and they have shown that even in the context of debate of epistemology and apologetics, the soteriological dimension had primacy. So far, the definitive book on Hadot and Buddhism has been that edited by David Fiordalis. David has been trained at the University of Chicago by Matthew Kapstein, who has been also teaching at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in Paris, where Pierre Hadot used to teach before being appointed to the Collège de France. I had myself the chance to study for my master and PhD with Matthew Kapstein, and this is how I got into Hadot's stuff, so to speak. And compared to the study of ancient Indian Buddhism, the study of Tibetan Buddhism, which is my main specialty, offers a particular perspective because it's actually the living continuation of Indian Buddhism down to the present day. So we can observe many in the Tibetan and Himalayan cultural world, many interrelations on the spot in vivo between monastic scholastic studies on one hand and yogic meditative practices on the other hand. And an important element of Kapstein's contribution has been to really build his analysis on a particular genre of Indian and Tibetan Buddhist literature, that of so-called spiritual instructions, or here called Tibetan technologies of the self. And those texts are really devoted to the actual implementation of spiritual exercises, ranging again from discursive to non-discursive practices. And I will give here an example of an Indian master for this genre and the highlight of this genre. So he wrote, Nowadays, sentient beings, time, patience, views of and life are subjects to degeneration. Since there is no need to learn the text and be aware that he was a scholar, a really top scholar, top-notch scholar. So his instructions then is to cultivate the yoga, which is meditation, contemplation of the essential meaning. Nowadays, there is no time to learn the vast text because Buddhist tradition have really accumulated so many texts. So those texts were like ships to cross the ocean of suffering, but it's better, according to him, to abandon all that disturbs the mind and cultivate only the oral, direct, practical instructions of genuine people. That means accomplished practitioners. Life is short and there are many things to know, but since we do not even know the direction of our lives, so like the swan that extracts milk from water, this is a bit Indian mythology, select carefully among the objects of your desire. So there is this injunction of really wrap up what are the main points of Buddhist philosophy, basically, and then to put them into practice. So in my own doctoral dissertation with Matthew Kapshin, I focused actually on this genre in the intellectual history of Tibetan Buddhism. And in this published form, I have further referred to the works of Pirado in order to retrace the life, works, and heritage of a Tibetan author and framing it as a Tibetan quest of wisdom. Because the concept of wisdom is in its very name, Prajnarashmi, and it is used in his works as a very central notion in order to organize a great diversity of Indian scholastic and yogic traditions in Tibet. So James Apel has also well explored this literature, and especially he has shown very beautifully how actually the philosophy of the Madhyamaka school that we tend to think as pure philosophy is very connected actually to a process of personal transformation, especially on the text he chose to focus on. And as pointed by many scholars in the field, the articulation between discourse and way of life is conceived in Buddhism according to the three steps of wisdom. I'm going to talk about it in the paper. And this was beautifully elucidated in reference to Pirado by David Fiordalis. And I've also edited myself a special issue on this topic or published already a couple of articles. But here is, I would like just to present the overall model. The notion of spiritual exercise taught by Pirado covers a variety of dimensions, and the three types of wisdom or three exercises of wisdom offers a very useful categorization in three main elements that have developmental, intergenerational, and epistemological implications. So we find this classification from the earliest discourses, but it has been particularly developed in the Mahayana and especially in the Yogacara school. So it is centered on the very idea of wisdom, and in Buddhist art, it is often personified as this female deity. And this is really the overarching or transcending virtue. It is also called the mother of all Buddhas because it is the very matrix of awakening. So such figure or such art functions, I think, very much as a scheme in the Kantian sense, offering a sensible representation of a guiding concept. And we can now look briefly at her different hands as expressing its various facets. So while ethics is defined as the foundation of this process, the first type of wisdom is the wisdom born from study and literally hearing or listening. And this shows the importance of oral transmission in the context of studying directly with a teacher, and then by extension, studying text, reading text, who are like the repository of ancient teachers. So the second step is a wisdom born from reflection, thinking by oneself, and making personally and critically sense of the teachings, and using the power of logical reasoning. And the third step is a wisdom born from meditation, or more literally, cultivation. And I will look in the chapter at its two main aspects. Michael Chase referred already a bit to that dichotomy, calm abiding or insight or concentration and contemplation, or in modern terms, focused attention and open monitoring. And this connects discursive to non-discursive forms of knowing. And it is this process of habituation that allows one to fully live according to the direct vision of the truth or in Buddhist parlance, of things as they truly are. So generally, linear progression is emphasized in didactic writings, but if we go on the field, we can see that it's very much like a circular fashion, and it's especially linking developmental and intergenerational perspectives. So even after practice, there's generally a need to go back to practice and debate. But most importantly, once this process of study, reflection, debate, and practice has been mastered, then the former student becomes a teacher. And he's then to teach the new generation of students, debate with them, or compose text to their attention. Thus, this is very much a model of intergenerational transmission, of the regeneration of the tradition, each generation having to reactualize through this threefold process the actual content of the legacy of the ancients. And with the scheme in mind, I intend in the paper then to offer a historical overview of Buddhist teachings, texts, and schools by using especially this adoption orientation. I am aware of time, so I may not read everything, but I just want to start by saying that for centuries, the Buddha Shakyamuni's teachings were initially memorized upon hearing and ritually recited for centuries before finally being written down and organized into the Buddhist canon. So we see a very strong emphasis from the beginning on oral culture, on memory, and memory is actually what is meant by mindfulness. So there is this, we're going to talk about that because memory is really far from being only the remembrance of the past. Rather, it is the very organizing intelligence that guides behavior in each moment according to the categories and teachings that have been internalized and that are thus retrievable at will in order to face the various situations of life. And many of you who are well aware of Epictetus will find a lot of connections with that. So maybe I will skip. I have a long, not too long, but a part on the history of Buddhism. I will just maybe, in the interest of time, move a bit forward. I just want to insist on the point that scriptures are extraordinarily important in Buddhism. Indeed, and the Buddhist canon, Pali Canon, for example, is composed of monastic discipline that was created in the process of life, actually. It was really a bottom-up approach. Then we have the sutta that are circumstantial discourses. So this is somehow comparable to Plato's dialogues, although there is no Socratic method of dialectics, indeed. And then we have the Abhidhamma that moves from those very circumstantial and contextual discourses to a scholastic systematization. And we find really something that is very systematization, this aspect, this very important aspect of philosophy, but most probably this systematic literature evolved from actually establishing lists in order to memorize. And again, memorization is not just rote learning, is in order to really integrate and internalize the Buddhist teachings. So briefly, I think what I'm going to show in this history of Buddhism is to see the constant interplay. Every period, there will be sometimes when the emphasis had been too much on practice, we will find a new need for studying, for analyzing. And when analyzing is going too far, we see another school appearing or reasserting the importance of meditative practice. So I think this is quite interesting. And this is not just my own idea about the Buddhist history. It's very much well analyzed by, for example, Rupert Gethin in the book that I did present at the beginning. So after the systematization of Abhidharma, for example, we find this literature of the Prajnaparamita Sutra, with actually basically clearing away every attitude of listing and insisting on the supreme wisdom of emptiness. So actually this literature was then systematized. So after this emphasis on direct insight, we have a very totally extraordinary and major systematization in the writings of Nagarjuna. and the so-called Madhyamaka. I'm sure most of you are very aware of this teacher and teachings, and I have learned that now in France, in the baccalaureate, in the subject of philosophy, is one of the Indian author, is the only Indian author that is now being listed. And I think that for Chinese philosophy, it is Chuangzi. So we have the middle way, but the middle way can also be seen as a form of analytical meditation. So that's one form of meditation, and the other form being meditative absorption. We have them a few centuries later, their school, Yogacara, that insists on the practice of yoga, that means meditation. And especially when we read the life of Asanga, we see that he particularly devoted his time in his early career to actually reaching very deep states of meditative absorption. So this school is very important because it really offers an extraordinary sophistication of Buddhist psychology, very fine analysis of substrate consciousness, so to speak, or subconsciousness. We have then also the important notion of Buddha nature. I'll offer an overall sketch of that. And I will also, of course, then after there would be Buddhist epistemology that is particularly emphasized when we talk with philosophers. It's extremely important. We have here a lot of insights about perception, knowledge, reasoning, intuition, apperception, and self-awareness, and including very refined rational examination of meditative experiences. So I will go a bit quickly now. And of course, then we have also a considerable monument of late Indian Buddhism, which is esoteric or tantric Buddhism. And it does have a connection with philosophy, actually. And there is indeed a striking parallel with the development of theurgy that Matthew Sharp mentioned briefly, I think, in the first day, and in later Neoplatonism. So I will be also mentioning this idea. And of course, the difficult question is really the institutional nature of those schools. How were they connected together? But actually, really, monasteries, universities were probably the most important institutional support for those schools. And in Tibet, it was more the lineages of spiritual instructions that serve to really convey those different their content, so to speak. So in China and Korea and Japan, the different Buddhist schools or sects became more narrowly centered on specific texts. But we have with Zen or Chan a borderline case, so to speak, and not unlike the Kalimit of the Cynics for Ado, because the school, which is literally the school of meditative absorption, dhyana, is well defined by this principle, not depending upon scriptures. It is a spatial transmission beyond exegesis, directly pointing at a person's mind and realizing one's Buddha nature. So we'll pass on those elements a little bit later. So I want to talk a little bit about the ways of life in Buddhist traditions, lay versus monastic, scholar versus yogin, and center versus periphery. There are really oppositions between those two poles of discourse and practice among like the town-dwelling monks that are really scholar monks, the forest-dwelling monks that are meditators, and then we have the scholar, the pandita, versus the yogin or the siddha. But in the end, the ideal would be to combine the two aspects. Then later in Mahayana, and especially in Vajrayana, there will be extraordinary exploration to explore all sorts of ways of life, from really the center of society with rulers or aristocrats to the periphery with lower castes or even outcasts. And this idea was to sacralize mundane existence in all its aspects with splendor or terror and explore ways to use every circumstance as an opportunity for awakening. So a few more minutes. I'll talk again in the paper about tradition, reason, and intuition in Buddhist epistemology. That would be there will be also some hopefully useful summary of for philosophers of Buddhist theories and manuals of meditation. And again, there is this twofold paradigm: calm, abiding, and insight. And I tend to see a parallel with the twofold typology of Pierre Hadot: concentration of the self and expansion of self. Sorry?
Mark, you
yes.
have 5.
Okay, great. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. I should be okay. I want to insist in the end on mindfulness. Of course, the original Buddhist notion of mindfulness, and it originally means memory, and it is thus very much the Buddhist equivalent of the Greek mnemosune. And like in ancient Greek religion, memory is much more than the remembrance of the past. It is a deepened presence of mind. And in Buddhist teachings, in Buddhist traditions, we can see how it helps to first keep Buddhist teachings present in mind, to formulate their adequate representation, and then to refine direct perception through attentiveness in the present moment. And mindfulness really defines, according to its continual cultivation, the Buddhist ethos of mindful awareness, self-examination or examination of conscience, in Hadot's words, and carefulness. Then I want to take two texts as examples. One very early, a text from early Buddhism, from the Pali Canon, that exists in Chinese. This is the famous Satipatthana Sutta, the discourse on the ways to establish mindfulness. So it presents a concrete path of the cultivation of self-awareness and self-mastery in 4 sequences that are considered to form also the foundation of Mahayana. So these are the ways to establish mindfulness to the body, to feelings, to the mind, and to phenomena. And I'd like to insist on this model because it appears to be both memorable, 4 categories, and applicable to any life circumstance. And it also presents in a very compact form a Buddhist anthropology, philosophy of the body, of emotion, of mind, and phenomenology, and with the major mediating concept and function of the breath. And it does include important considerations on mindfulness of death, the Buddhist version of memento mori. Then I'll take a more recent but still pre-modern Buddhist text, a text by the 18th century Tibetan Dzogchen master, Jigme Lingpa. And in these materials that I've recorded is direct instructions, or this is a literature of really direct instructions in response to lively questions from disciples. He offered an extraordinary overview of the centrality of mindfulness in Indian, Chinese, and Tibetan Buddhism, and on its different styles of practice, progressing from moment to moment application to resting in timeless presence, so to speak. And we find here an echo of the exercise of the concentration on the present moment, central to Hadot's works, and culminating in a way that is similar to Goethe's statement, rendered by Hadot as "presence is the sole goddess that I adore." So in the end, I'll try to propose Buddhist philosophy as mindful living. And here I'm really talking about philosophy. It doesn't mean we have to accept all those different traditions. We can choose what makes sense for us. And in this notion of mindful living, I mean something a bit like what Pierre Hadot meant with la vie selon l'esprit, or life according to the spirit. And what I really think is important, and this will hopefully connect with Michael Shea's final chapter in the final section on contemplative studies, I think that philosophy as a way of life has a huge role to play in order to further mediate Buddhist studies more in the sense of religious studies that I've also tried to map out with modern psychology. So I think really philosophy as a way of life is really in the middle to serve as a cross-cultural and interdisciplinary bridge. So ultimately, and this was my really very final remarks, I want to conclude the chapter with few remarks on the contemplation of nature. And this is something I intend to explore further in collaboration with Michael Chase in the years to come, because Japanese traditional architecture and garden design offers actually a form of strategic retreat for recovering the perspective of the whole, or the view from above in Hadot's term. And this is especially true and beautifully true in Zen and rock gardens in Kyoto that are meant to represent the vast ocean and mountains of the entire Taoist Buddhist cosmos. And what these spaces offer to today's lovers of wisdom is the possibility to regain a sense of wholeness of body and mind, of reason and emotion, breath and nature, and fundamentally, a heartfelt sense of co-living, symbiosis, or interbeing in the world of Thich Nhat Hanh, from which maybe also to rediscover simply the joy of living. So I'll conclude by saying la philosophie comme manière de vivre in Buddhist context and beyond is, I believe, inseparable from la joie de vivre. Thank you very much.
So now you have 10 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. So I'm very curious to hear about your experience as a scholar who works on a field that is not about scholarship, really. You mentioned that you're working on a tradition that relies widely on oral transmission, initiations, all sorts of practices that are set as preconditions to access texts in some cases. I have no scholarly experience, no scholarly knowledge of Buddhism, but I have a bit of an experience of practice because I spent 2 summers in southern France. There are many monasteries there. And I was surprised by so many contrasts between our tradition and this very foreign tradition where I remember, for example, a case where lamas were talking about texts during a teaching, and then I went to see the lama after the teaching and asked to actually read the text because I was very interested. And the lama said, "I'm very sorry, but you cannot get access to that text before you finished with the preliminary practice of the 100,000 prostrations or prostration, I think in English." So for me, it was shocking, you know. I want to learn, I want to get to know these texts, but I can't because before I have to go through all these conditions that involve, in some cases, physical practices of getting on the ground, your face on the ground 100,000 times before you get access to the text. I'm curious about you. Do you encounter obstacles in your study of this tradition because there's material that is not accessible to you because there are conditions that, well, perhaps you're a practitioner, I don't know. But if you are not, is it the case that there are things that you don't have access to?
Thank you very much. A very important question. I think that not all Buddhist teachers are that conservative. So there are many different approaches, and some approaches that are more open to Westerners. But I think what is really interesting in philosophy as a way of life. So some people like me who have trained a lot in religious studies and went to the field can somehow serve to map out the territory. But I think it doesn't mean we have necessarily to do all what they say, and that's maybe the difference between philology and history and philosophy. And I'd like maybe to share one more slide that I didn't have, and I really want to talk about that in the chapter. I think this balance is very important for our work. The first so if we're talking about the reactualization of the ancient ideal of philosophy and really use Buddhist sources in order to inspire our ways of life, I think there is one problem, which is, of course, being satisfied with philosophical discourse. But the other one is to do without philosophical reflection. And I see in this part a critique of what I have seen quite a lot in some so-called spiritual or Buddhist communities. And if we don't do, there is this notion of deviance, but I think the French was more something like aberration. And I've seen a lot of aberrations, I must say, also. So I don't necessarily encourage you to do whatever some Buddhist teachers say. Quite the contrary. And it's possible actually to meet also some scholars. And what is really quite fantastic with the Tibetan tradition, that many of the teachers are also scholars. and can have a very philosophical approach as well. Yeah, so I think we need to be quite careful when we approach a tradition that is very, very colorful, like Tibetan Buddhism, for example. There is a lot of, and this is why I think philosophical discourse is useful now, but it was also useful even in the early days, because, for example, after the fall of the Tibetan Empire, Tantric Buddhism led to a lot of crazy stuff in Tibet. And then you had new masters like Atisha coming from India saying, guys, you can't do that. You have to go back to the basics. You have to study, you have to behave, you have to stop. And now we talk about Tantra as sex. Sex is like the nicest part of Tantra. There are a lot of weird things. And because the goal is to go way beyond the comfort zone. So really, really, really. So I think like aberration, and I'm here, like today I'm in Tokyo, actually I'm traveling, and Japan has been very, very careful, because there were new religions in Japan that created like terrorist attacks. And a lot of their ideas were inspired by Indian Buddhist or Tibetan Buddhist stuff. So we need to be careful, and I think this is why philosophy as a way of life is such a wonderful field, because it's both able, we can understand, and again, okay, this is already a long response, but thanks a lot. But be careful. You can meet scholars and people who are more centered on the main point. No need to do things that are maybe for other contexts. Yeah.
We have 4 minutes remaining for questions.
Yes. Yes, thank you very much, Marc-Henri, for a fascinating journey, I would say, through the Buddhist history and philosophy as a way of life. I really liked when you talked about memorization and said that it's a way to internalize the Buddhist teachings, and you briefly referred to Epictetus. Recently, I studied Paul Rabo, the classicist who is also referenced by Hadot, and he extensively writes about memorization. But he also connects it more explicitly to Epicurus, actually. So I do agree that there's definitely links with Epictetus, but the letters written by Epicurus, for instance, seem to be like compendia written for his students for the exclusive purpose to memorize, and yeah, with the same idea to internalize the teaching. So I thought that was an interesting kind of link between what you said and PWL in the Western sense. And then finally, you ended with your ambition to do further research and study, with respect to nature and contemplation, etc. So that is actually pretty much the topic of my presentation later. So I would really like to invite you there. I know that it's probably dinner time where you are at the moment. Hopefully,
alas, it might be difficult, but we can engage, I think, together once we have the chapters all together. And what I think is really interesting with nature is that, and especially in Japan, because it doesn't have to, those places, that some of the places that I have shown are also places that I've tried to get rid from many very, very heavy stuff like rituals and beliefs. So this need to really go to what's the main point. It's not new. And I must say that sometimes in the Tibetan tradition, they want to keep everything. and the Zen tradition, and that is actually, it's not always known, but in Japan, the Zen tradition was following actually Tantric Buddhism. It was many Zen monasteries were originally Tantric temples, and Zen meditation was considered to be really the essence, the main point. So I think nature, the contemplation of nature, is extraordinary in Japan. And of course, this connects with Chinese philosophy. Is really a place actually that I think is very appropriate, very universal also. And I think we are all here in philosophy as a way of life, having this sense of cosmopolitanism, so to speak. We want also to appreciate the diversity, but also reach a certain universality. And maybe this is the very words of Pierre Hadot, actually, so to rise to this. Yeah, so I think nature is really, really, so this is really something I want to, we'll be in touch, because there is really in the making. Yeah.